Welcome to Shaken Not Burned, a cocktail of solutions for a sustainable future. I'm Felicia Jackson.
And I am Giulia Bottaro. Each week we interview experts to talk about parts of the sustainable transition and what you and your business need to know to succeed.
Sustainability is complex and constantly evolving, and it can be hard for a business to adapt and remain competitive.
We are here to help you learn all about the changing economy and the ongoing transition.
So join us as we explore the concepts and the tools you need to plot a course for a sustainable future. Hello and welcome back to the latest episode of Shaken Not Burned, a cocktail of solutions for a sustainable future. Today we're going to be talking about the Paris Agreement. It's the international agreement that binds countries in their decision-making in how to address the challenge of climate change. There's discussions about whether it's effective, about whether business is a better way of doing it, but I think it's really important to understand what it is and how it works, as well as the implications of what's going on around it. Now, today we're lucky enough to be joined by Dr. Harold Hooibaum, who is the chair of the Centre for Energy and Climate Policy at SOAS, University of London. Welcome, Harold. The first thing I want to ask you about the Paris Agreement is, what is the process? You know, we talk about the climate negotiations, but what are they? And then I think the next important question is really, why are these negotiations, this process, so important and yet problematic?
Well, in short, the climate convention process is the process by which delegations from the countries that participate in this process, we call them parties, meet at so-called conferences of the parties, or COPs, to discuss ways and agreements to address climate change. And the main outcome of this process has been the Paris Agreement. That's the process in a nutshell. I often like to explain it as a bit like capitalism. We think of it as the only game in town when it comes to, in this case, international climate negotiations. It involves nearly 200 countries with a few exceptions. Just like capitalism, liberal democracies and authoritarian regimes alike are at it. And just like capitalism, just because it's the only game in town being played, doesn't mean it isn't also deeply flawed. And this process certainly has its flaws and its detractors. When you have nearly 200 countries come together to try and work out international global response to climate change, you can imagine there will be a lot of differing and even opposing views under one roof. Countries have a different resource wealth, including fossil fuels they want to bring to market. They have different technological capacities in renewables, for example. They have different knowledge bases, different financial resources, but they also have, importantly, different responsibilities for creating the problem in the first place, that is greenhouse gas emissions, as well as, of course, vastly different exposures to the impacts of climate change. Just think of sub-Saharan African countries or small island developing states that are very climate vulnerable but have very little adaptive capacity. And so you end up with a process that tries to make progress when you have both very ambitious and sometimes, existentially threatened countries trying to advance climate goals. And at the same time, you have some saboteurs who are trying to slow things down and delay the necessary action. This is in part why senior figures also from within that process called for an overhaul of the process at the start of last year's COP in Cancun. What you arrive at the end of all of this is a negotiated outcome. In the case of the Paris Agreement, that's a more bottom-up approach rather than one that imposes emission targets on countries from the top down. And in many ways, that's suboptimal because it doesn't actually do what is really required to fully address the problem. But you can argue it's as good as it can get at this point in time if you take seriously multilateral outcomes. And I think we do still very much need those. It's not a problem for an individual country, it's a global problem. If I were to borrow and repurpose a line from my colleague Nick Westcott, countries will only be able to get on top of this challenge if they hang together. And if they don't, they'll all hang separately.
You see, there's something really interesting that you're bringing out here, especially with the mention of saboteurs, because you talk about capitalism as being the only game in town, talk about the negotiations as the main game in town. But wasn't it at the last COP that there were 7,000 representatives from fossil fuel and agriculture companies all trying to pressure negotiations away from increased targets, increased action?
I think it's natural in any of these international conferences, perhaps more so at climate conferences, that we see very large numbers of lobbyists present. They are present not just at the negotiations, of course, they're also very much present at the domestic level, working with governments and trying to influence them before they go to the COPs for negotiating outcomes. So that goes on all the time. There's nothing new. I think the number of lobbyists present at the last COP and the last few COPs working for fossil fuel industries, working for some of the large industries that need to be regulated has grown. That's a challenge. I would caution, though, that many of those lobbyists are not necessarily in what we call the blue zone, where negotiating parties are present. Some of them are in the green zone without the kind of level of access that you would necessarily need to have. But it is concerning. It is a reflection of the problems we're currently seeing, which is that things are slowing down. There are some companies that are walking back commitments. There are some countries that are watering down commitments, and delay is something that we cannot really have given the urgency of the situation.
How likely do you think it is that countries are going to actually hit their targets? And I'm interested in this in the context of what you were saying of the shift of the Paris Agreement being from the top-down approach, which was sort of mandatory action, to this bottom-up approach that is working together and hopefully looking at peer pressure to see an increase in activity.
Well, some countries will hit their targets. Some have made rather more ambitious pledges than others. The UK, for example, has consistently shown international leadership with a relatively clear roadmap to 2050, although a number of steps still need to be taken and put in place for things to actually happen. Other countries have too, but we have seen shifts and changes in nationally determined contributions. So that's the NDCs that together are supposed to deliver on our global climate targets. So we set an overarching global target, but that is to be achieved through the combination of all the countries' nationally determined contributions from the bottom up, as opposed to imposing targets from the top down. So it is up to countries, to the parties, to deliver on this ambition and to submit NDCs that contain the kind of measures we need to achieve this outcome through collective action. That's really the way it works.
So would that be then measures that include integrating awareness of climate risk into the financial system, ensuring that companies report on resource use, shifting away from the use of fossil fuels towards renewables, or transitioning towards greener forms of industrial activity?
A lot of that is contained within the NDCs with specific targets, with specific goals for sectors and industries. Some NDCs are a lot more detailed than others. But just to complete that earlier point, while we have some countries that have shown more ambition, we also have a number of countries that have not shown a lot of ambition and that have not submitted updated NDCs that we need to see if we want to ratchet up ambition to the point where we can achieve the overall goal of the Paris Agreement, which is to keep the rise in global average surface temperatures to below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. The Paris Agreement also has an ambition target, which is not an official goal, but it's the ambition, and that's 1.5 degrees. I think we all realize now that the 1.5 degree ambition is not achievable any longer. The world surpassed that threshold last year, I think, for the first time. But now it's all about making sure that we remain well below 2 degrees of additional warming. And that's getting to be tough, no doubt. We're not on track at the moment.
That sort of raises the elephant in the room, because for this action to be effective, we need countries to work together. We need a multilateral approach. And yet we've got the US that has pulled out of the climate agreement. We've got the European Union, which is planning on postponing action on the Corporate Social Responsibility Directive and the Corporate Due Diligence Directive. And the argument always seems to be that it costs too much to do. It's too expensive. It's too much of a burden on business. But there seems to me to be this issue of not looking at timeframes in a sensible way, because something that's really expensive now might mean that you end up with something cheaper in the future. And it's this, what do you think is going to happen with the countries that are pulling out?
I think it's not just an emphasis on the costs. I think it's also a misunderstanding of the various benefits that are materializing in the here and now and in the near to medium term, not just in the long distant future, of taking concerted and ambitious climate action. I think we're not fully accounting for those benefits and those opportunities. We tend to emphasize costs. But I would also want to remark that, for example, if we take the renewables picture in the years since the Paris Agreement, the last 10 years, or even the last 20 years, if we go back further, renewables have made incredible progress, not just in installed capacity globally, but also in their cost profiles. They're a lot cheaper and they're returning profits. And we can say similar things for other technologies. We tend to emphasize the costs of taking action, but we're not really emphasizing very effectively the various benefits and opportunities from doing what we're doing, from making sure our economies are climate resilient, not just the mitigation side of the equation, but also the adaptation side. I think I would say more broadly, we are expecting a lot from this process, and we're not getting a lot. I think it's fair to actually expect a lot. This is a monumental problem. It affects all of us and many of us in very dramatic ways. We should certainly expect a response that's commensurate with this challenge. And it's a big but. The way the process works, it is not really able to deliver as much and as quickly as needed. Unfortunately, as I said before, when you have nearly 200 countries trying to negotiate outcomes, with very dramatically different views on the energy sources they want to use and how they want to transition, if they want to transition at all. It's going to be tough to do, but we have to take steps to head into that direction.
I mean, one of the things I'd love to do, if you don't mind, is taking a little segue into some of the work that you're doing on the triple dividend, because I'm fascinated by this idea of awareness of the cost and making a comparison over time. But you talk about the benefits that we're actually gaining. And I think there seems to be this fundamental failure at the heart of the current financial system, that we only talk about immediate financial return and numbers that we can count. But there are massive benefits in terms of the protection of nature, cleaner air, better medical care, all that come hand in hand with more climate friendly development. Can you tell me a little bit about the work that you've been doing on that?
Yeah, I suppose the full benefit accounting for climate adaptation interventions and resilience building interventions is relatively new. This idea of the triple dividend of resilience has been around for a number of years, originally developed by my colleagues Tom Tanner and Svenja Szyminski and others. It's the idea that doing something about climate adaptation, taking the measures we take to protect against floods and storms and droughts and wildfires and the various different impacts of climate change, that this carries a so-called triple dividend, benefits that fall into three different categories. One is the avoided loss category. This is what we do to protect against the climate impact, the flood, the storm, the wildfire, the drought, their impacts on assets, on human lives and livelihoods. And if we can take the necessary measures to protect against that, we have a benefit, right, from having protected against the climate impact. But we find that beyond that, there are other benefits. There are, in a second dividend category, so-called induced development benefits. If I invest in the flood barrier, if I invest in the protection of whatever asset in whatever regional part of the world, I draw in more investment. I create jobs. I create additional economic activity. Just look at the Thames Barrier and what that did to East London and various different parts of the city that have seen over the years dramatic investment in real estate, in a growth of residential property, commercial properties, and an expansion of the city, really, made possible by this protective measure. And it's a protective measure against the impacts of climate change or of flooding, but it has so many more impacts that we can actually measure and quantify. And the third dividend, which is environmental and social benefits. So, for example, with the measures we undertake, we also reduce CO2 emissions. We see that a lot with adaptation actions. We do the work on looking through project appraisal documents, economic appraisal of interventions, of spending on climate adaptation. We find that in many instances, adaptation projects are also good mitigation projects, be they in agriculture, be they in forestry, be they in other sectors. So there are wider benefits that can be quantified, that we can in some instances monetize, and that really show to us that the benefits of investing in adaptation to both wider society and the public, but also to private actors and investors, are far greater than commonly assumed, and they're much bigger than just looking at those avoided losses. That can help us make a case for investment.
Yeah, and I think that's what's really important, because I think the big concern here and now is that the Paris Agreement has its challenges, that the climate negotiations process has its challenges, but that with what is going on at a country level and with the current geopolitical situation, it's looking far and far less likely that there will be a global multilateral approach that involves everybody. So what do we do? Because it is those rules that were set by the Paris Agreement or previously set by Kyoto that were the reasons countries and regions implemented actions. The EU ETS came about as a means of solving the EU's need to cut carbon emissions. So without that, how do we get society, how do we get the economy, how do we get companies to change their behavior? And if you're talking about an awareness of avoided losses or other benefits, you've actually got a really, really different argument that you're making about what companies should do and why.
I think we do need to make or adjust the argument depending on the audience we have. Different audiences are going to respond to different parts of that argument and parts of that story we tell. It needs to be possible for them to see how their interests are at stake. For the private sector, this is a conversation around return on investment, how they deal with risk and profit. For the public sector, it's a somewhat different story to tell. And even within those two groups, there are different audiences with different investment appetites, different appetites to make interventions and to make changes. And I think tailoring that is important. And we can, because it's a very broad and complex topic that we have here. I would like to take a step back and just caution against dismissing the process altogether. We know it doesn't produce the outcomes that we necessarily want to see as quickly as we want to see them. But the process has certainly seen shifts over recent years, which suggests that, it is moving in directions that can be helpful and that do more to try and address the key challenges. So one of the main shifts has been climate finance moving into the foreground, when it really wasn't that big of a conversation in the early days of the negotiations, not just in terms of mobilizing more overall, we do need more climate finance, but also striking that balance between mitigation and adaptation, and of course also the establishment of the fund for responding to loss and damage and how to get that more capitalized. That's a whole other question that we don't need to address here now. But there have also been shifts in a focus on a fair and equitable transition that brings people and different groups along, rather than one that's simply oriented on climate goals only. So it's about a just transition that can build that support amongst various different groups. And there's been a shift from pledges, which we have seen, to action and tangible results, taking stock of progress, ratcheting up ambition. And I think what's really interesting to see is that following the US decision to leave the Paris Agreement for a second time, there hasn't exactly been a stampede amongst countries to follow suit. And I think that's a really important shift as well. 10 years ago, and the Paris Agreement was negotiated in 2015, 10 years ago. If the US had said and done that it was leaving around the time of the Paris Agreement or even before, it could have led to a much larger number of defections. But today that is not the case. And that speaks to the process. But it really also speaks to the shifts and changes all around it and all around us. Renewables today perform very well in many countries. The impacts of climate change can be seen and felt from major floods in England last year to heat waves in India and elsewhere. So that really contextualizes this process and its changes and adaptability over time.
I think one of the things that interests me in terms of how we as a people respond to this issue is this idea of how pertinent and how real it feels. Because I remember when COVID hit and all this money was raised towards finding a vaccine, there was a complete mobilization of everyone involved. And I remember someone saying to me, the difference between COVID and climate is COVID was happening to everyone all at once and it was right next to you if it wasn't happening to you immediately. And the problem with climate is that historically it's been far away and affected people who weren't you. And what we're now seeing is no matter where you are, floods, wildfires, you look at Valencia last year, you look at LA at the end of last year. I mean, this is something that is happening to everyone everywhere, and hopefully that will transform the way in which we respond. I can tell that you have a strong sense that there's an important role for the negotiations and that they do play a critical part in how we actually address these challenges. You've talked about how the process has changed over time. Where do you think we go from here?
I do see an important role in setting the framework, which it is, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, setting a framework for action, providing platforms for more ambition and more activity going forward. Not all of the issues in their detail will be solved and resolved by the Climate Convention process. It cannot, due to the problems that we've outlined, but it needs to be there to set the scene, to set the stage, as it were, to provide that important backdrop, that important voice that leads us into the right direction. And on top of that, we then need to layer and build other activities and other reorientation of our focus. I think a key, and that takes us back to what we just discussed, I think a key has got to be on adaptation. And we need to do way more on that than we have before. The United Nations Environment Programme, UNEP, reminds us every year that there is a large and growing adaptation finance gap. The world is completely unprepared for the very dramatic impacts of a warming world. We just saw that in California. We see it in so many places around the world. It gets more media attention when it happens in Los Angeles than when it happens in the developing parts of the world. That doesn't mean it's not happening elsewhere and happening in worse ways elsewhere. The wildfires, floods, storms, droughts, heat waves, all of which are made worse by climate change. We know that, and the enormous losses and damages that these bring. But we're also not well prepared, as I said before, to seize the opportunities, the wider benefits from investing in adaptation and resilience. The 1.5 degree ambition is not achievable any longer. We're now marching to 2 degrees. The impacts on the ground will only get worse. And that speaks to your point of people see it, people realize it and feel it. It impacts their lives, their livelihoods. It impacts assets, it impacts wealth, it impacts economic activity. So we need to act now and put in place measures through significantly enhanced finance to prepare for this. In the early days of the Climate Convention process, adaptation was more of an afterthought, right? It was there, but the main focus was definitely on mitigation. And good mitigation really is good adaptation because you avoid or reduce the problem in the first place. So it made sense. But now that we realize that we cannot achieve certain targets and goals any longer, and that it's not enough any longer, we need to do more on adaptation, and we need to do it quickly.
I suppose we need to adapt to the new environment that we're going to be living in. I think another thing that is really important and I think isn't discussed enough is that the UNFCCC is one of the 3 framework conventions that came out of the Rio conference, and that one of them is to combat desertification and another one is to combat nature loss and biodiversity loss. And actually, those 3 things are completely interconnected. We don't have a food system if everything turns to a desert. If we lose biodiversity, we lose nature, we lose the underpinnings of how the economy works. And I always try and stick to the economy because I think there is that ethical element, as you were talking about the just transition, that we need to think about the human side of this equation. But it feels so much of the time that politicians only listen to money. And so if you want to get that lever for change, you have to get them to understand the potential for long-term loss.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you raised those other 2 conventions. They're very important, as you've pointed to, the Convention on Biodiversity for nature loss, biodiversity, but also the UNCCD with its focus on not just deserts, but more generally land degradation. I know that relatively well because I worked with the UNCCD and the Global Mechanism for a short while. And I attended a COP for the UNCCD in Accra a long time ago. And those conventions and those approaches did not receive anywhere near the attention and support that the UNFCCC received. And I think one of these other shifts is that increasingly we begin to realize, have begun to realize, that there's these interconnections, and that the work that the UNCCD does, the Convention on Biodiversity, these are critically important and connected up to the climate world rather than looking at them in isolation. And they have received more attention, more focus, as they should. But I think, in fairness, it can be very difficult for policymakers, for investors, for any type of stakeholder, for all of us as ordinary citizens, to really grasp the complexities, interconnections of this issue, which is one of the problems for us not really moving fast and decisively enough at times. It's a very intricate and very complex system that ideally needs to be addressed in its entirety. And that's not easy to do for humans who like to compartmentalize and who like to divide labor.
Think in systems.
No,
and that's actually right. One of the things, I know that we've had discussions about this, that you need to take a different approach to how you look at problem solving, because you can't look at things in isolation and expect them not to have knock-on effects on everything around them.
Yeah.
So that can be really, really challenging.
What would be your solution to, if there is a solution to this process? Where do we take this process now? How do we build on it? How do we make it more effective?
I think one of the real challenges is people's lack of understanding of how it works, the lack of understanding of what's going on. Every year I listen to people talk about how, there wasn't a strong response out of the COP. When you know how the process works and you see what people go through to actually reach the agreements they do, you know that it's a miracle that you get anywhere. There have been terrible things where, you haven't got targets for climate finance, or there's been language around moving away from fossil fuels, and that's been removed from the final agreement documentation 2 or 3 times now. And of course, especially with young people who are just looking at what's going on and saying, why is there not faster change? Why does this not work? But part of the reason for that is, as far as I'm concerned, part of the reason for much bureaucracy is to make sure people don't make stupid decisions. So it's a very long and slow process. And that, unfortunately, I think is really mismatched with the urgency of the problem. So the challenge then becomes, how do you leverage what's out there and people's feelings about it? And how do you get action that will not simply be smacked down by those in power? Because you just have to look at what was happening last year. Well, actually, for the last few years, where climate activists are going to prison for fairly long periods of time, while other forms of crime are not actually being addressed. And you just think that's because this is something that the government sees as a problem. This is something that, supporters of the status quo see a problem. Now, I'm not suggesting that everybody go out and become an activist. I think there are huge challenges around civil disobedience. But the reality to me is that there has to be some way to find communication between those who wish the world to stay exactly as it is and those who wish to change it in order for the majority of people to survive in a reasonable, functional way. That probably sounds a little bit melodramatic, but actually, I think there's a lot of thinking out there which is, this is all somebody else's problem. And actually, I don't mean that in terms of it's all of our individual responsibility to make sure that we don't use the car and we don't do this, because there's this whole discussion that goes on about how it's individuals who shouldn't fly, who shouldn't eat meat, blah, blah, blah. That's the greatest con that's ever been played, because as human beings, we only have choices between the options in front of us. And if the system provides us with a set of options which are designed to appeal as being cheap and affordable and functional and they get things done, most people do not have time to sit around thinking about existential questions. So, I think there is something fundamentally wrong with the system we've got. If I knew how to fix it, obviously, I very much doubt we'd be sitting here having this conversation. I'd be out there changing the world. But part of what I think is important is having these conversations, actually thinking about what matters, who should act, who can act. Because while I still think it's a con that we're all made to feel like it's all our fault, the reality is the actions we take do make a difference. It's not a question of giving up meat, perhaps, but if you eat meat 5 days a week, why are you not eating it only 3 days a week? Because fundamentally, after energy, the agriculture sector is one of those most responsible for emissions and resource extraction and water pollution, because that's fertilizer and nitrogen. And obviously, I'm not going to go into lots of geeky detail, but these things do all interconnect. So, I'm just thinking about how we need to change the way we think about the system. We need better understanding of what's going on and what actually goes on in these different processes. I mean, the G20 has been saying they're going to cut subsidies for fossil fuels for what, 5 years now? And every year they have a meeting and nothing happens. And we talk about subsidies for renewables, but most people seem to forget that the fossil fuel industry gets massive subsidies every year. Level playing field is possibly a good place to start.
And has since its inception, which of course then becomes a legacy issue over many, many decades, where you build up a certain entrenched position based on the support you receive. That's right. I think what's important for the climate question is not just talking about, which is something we do a lot, building up renewables and building up low carbon solutions, which goes beyond just renewable energy sources, of course. Here in the UK and other countries, nuclear plays an important role. It doesn't in other countries, but it's a basket. But it's not just about building up those solutions. It's also about drawing down the alternative. And that's where the rubber really hits the road and where it gets really, really difficult, as you've just illustrated. I thought it was a really good point that you raised just earlier in your response just now on understanding the complexity of the process and how difficult it is, how many different players are involved, and that it doesn't necessarily always deliver the best possible outcome from the perspective of an outside observer, and how it's important to explain that. I think it's a general statement on politics and policymaking. I think one of the reasons we see the rise in populism, in far right, far left wing sort of alternatives that are really challenging to our democracies and our political systems, is that they promise easy solutions, quick fixes to really big problems that are so big and complex that they cannot be easily fixed and solved. It does require certain levels of understanding, and we have to, I agree with you, get better at explaining that, in bringing people along, in helping people understand and making them feel part of that process. I think that's part and parcel also of this just transition discourse that we have to talk about fair, equitable ways into this low carbon future, into this climate change future that takes various different groups and stakeholders along and says, this is your problem too, but together we can find a solution that works for all of us.
That's one of the reasons I'm so delighted you were able to join us today, because actually being able to have these conversations about what the Paris Agreement is, what it actually means, how it works and what the problems are a really important part of starting that broader conversation about how we actually approach things. Now, I'm going to ask you my favourite question of all time. What haven't I asked you about that you think I should have done, that we should have talked about with the Paris Agreement?
We don't want to focus too much on the Paris Agreement. I think there's a lot more that could be asked and discussed. There's been discussions around Article 6 and carbon trading and all the various different elements. Different working groups spend years, looking through the detail and how they can come up with an agreed wording on this for the next COP or for whatever other meeting. There's so much that's contained within it that we could talk about. But I think it's important to contextualize the Paris Agreement within the broader conversation we're having, within that broader conversation around shifts in our economies, in our societies, in our environment, the impacts it's having on ordinary people on the ground all around the world, not just in the developing South, global South, also in the North, but of course, adaptive capacity is different. So I think the key question for me is one that you did ask, for which we didn't really have the perfect answer, which is what's next? How do we build on this? Where do we take the Paris Agreement to make it work, to bring this process alive, to bring people along? I think we certainly need to take the next few steps. The convention process is going to be important, as I said, to provide that framework, to provide that backdrop, to help us agree global goals, but to bring those to life, to make those work, we need to have additional means, additional ways to achieve them. And that's the NDCs, but that's also a lot of action that happens domestically, that happens internationally, that happens at the local level. We haven't really talked about local dimensions so much, apart from climate impacts on the ground. But there's a lot of bottom-up action that cities and municipalities and local actors are taking too. So it's taking that next step.
And actually, we did even talk about that in relation to the US, because when the US pulled out of the climate treaty the first time, a lot of the states and the cities actually stood up to take action. And it's quite possible that they will do the same thing this time around.
Well, it looks like they already are in the US. New York State has already taken some steps, and California will follow suit, and others. They are pushing from below. And really, The Trump administration has, of course, direct influence over federal policy, as we see being demonstrated here in a very dramatic way over the last few weeks. But there's a limit to the impact that the federal administration can have on energy policy and environmental policy in the US, because a lot of that is retained within the power of states to set policy, to set and make sure there's interventions. That's the way the US system works, that states do have a lot of control over these policy domains. And I think we'll see a lot more of that in the future.
I personally find that very reassuring. I think we'll wind up here. I hope our listeners enjoyed learning a little bit about the Paris Agreement. And if any of you have got any great ideas about how we should move forward or what we should do, please do get in touch. As ever, if there are things you want to know more about, just let us know. Otherwise, Harold, thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll be back soon.
Thank you.